The wind had a way of making a man honest out on the high plains. It howled through the split-rail fences and pressed against the walls of the small ranch house as if testing how much longer it would stand. For the cowboy, loneliness wasn't a passing feeling, it was a condition of survival. Days stretched long and silent, broken only by the creak of leather, the lowing of cattle, and the rhythmic thud of his own boots against the hard-packed earth. He had learned to live without conversation, without laughter, without the warmth of another human presence. But learning to live without something did not mean he no longer needed it. The ranch had been his inheritance and his burden. After his parents' passing, it fell to him alone to keep the land productive, the animals fed, and the debts at bay. Neighbors were miles away, and town was a half-day ride if the weather was kind. Every decision had to be made quickly and alone, and every mistake carried weight. What he needed, more than anything, was stability. Someone to keep the house in order, to tend meals when his body was too exhausted to stand, to share the practical load of life on unforgiving land. Romance had never factored into his thinking. Love, in his mind, was a luxury for men who had time and money to spare. He had neither. He'd seen marriages built on poetry crumble under drought and illness. What survived out here were partnerships, quiet, steady arrangements that allowed two people to endure one might fail. That was how the idea of a mail-order bride took root. It wasn't shameful in his eyes, it was sensible. Other ranchers had done the same. Men as practical as he was, men who needed wives the way they needed fences and wells. The advertisements promised women willing to work, to settle, to build lives far from the noise of cities and the false promises of easy comfort. He imagined someone plain, grateful for shelter, content with a predictable life. Someone who wouldn't ask too many questions or stir too many emotions. Filling out the request felt stranger than he expected. He hesitated over the words describing himself, not wanting to exaggerate, but unsure how much honesty was too much. He described the ranch, the isolation, the hard work. He did not speak of his loneliness or the nights when the silence pressed so heavily on his chest it became difficult to breathe. Those were not things a man admitted, even to paper. When he sealed the envelope, there was no excitement in him, only resolve. This was not a dream, it was a solution. A wife would bring order to the house, maybe laughter in time, but he expected nothing more than competence and cooperation. He did not imagine conversation that challenged him or a presence that would alter the rhythm of his days. Certainly, he did not expect to be changed. As weeks passed and the response arrived, he told himself not to think too much about the woman on the other end of the arrangement. Whoever she was, she would arrive with her own reasons and her own expectations, and together they would make something workable out of necessity. Out on the plains, survival often looked like surrendering hope for more. Standing on the train platform on the day of her arrival, he carried those assumptions with him like armor. He believed he understood exactly what he was getting into, a simple exchange in a lonely land. He did not yet know that the choice he made out of practicality would be the moment his carefully contained life began to unravel. The train arrived with a scream of iron and steam, its dark shape cutting through the pale morning light like an intrusion from another world. The cowboy stood stiffly on the wooden platform, hat pulled low, hands tucked into his coat as if to anchor himself against the cold, and the unfamiliar anticipation twisting in his chest. He told himself he was only here to complete an arrangement. Still, his pulse quickened with every hiss of escaping steam. Passengers stepped down in clusters, families reuniting, merchants hauling crates, travelers eager to leave the dust of the rails behind. He scanned each woman automatically, measuring them against the image he had formed. Someone small, timid, plainly dressed, eyes lowered. A woman who would blend into the background of his life without disturbance. Then he saw her. She stepped down alone, moving carefully but without hesitation, as though she had already learned to navigate uncertain ground. Her coat was worn from travel, dusted with ash from the journey, and her gloves were mended at the fingers. Yet there was nothing fragile about her posture. She stood straight, lifting her chin to take in the unfamiliar surroundings, eyes sharp and observant. This was not a woman shrinking from the world. This was someone measuring it. For a moment he forgot to move. She did not look like the image he'd carried for weeks. There was an elegance to her, not the polished kind born of wealth, but the restrained grace of someone who had learned to endure without breaking. Her hair was pinned neatly, practical yet deliberate. When her gaze met his, she did not look away. Instead, she studied him in return, calm and assessing, as if she too had expectations she intended to verify. "You must be him," she said, her voice steady, carrying easily over the noise of the platform. The words struck him harder than he expected. He had imagined awkwardness, perhaps nervous gratitude. Instead, her tone held assurance. He managed to nod, suddenly aware of how little he had prepared for this moment. He introduced himself, his voice rougher than usual, and reached for her single suitcase before she could protest. Up close, the details unsettled him further. Her hands were strong, marked faintly by work, not the soft hands of someone sheltered. Her eyes held stories he could not yet read, pain perhaps, or resolve forged through loss. Whatever she had endured, it had shaped her into someone far from simple. As they walked away from the station, he realized people were watching. Heads turned. Whispers followed. It wasn't that she was strikingly beautiful. Though she was in her own quiet way, it was the way she carried herself, as if she belonged wherever she stood. He felt an unfamiliar tightening in his chest, a mixture of pride and unease. The wagon ride to the ranch was long and mostly silent. He expected her to fill the space with questions, but she didn't. Instead, she watched the land roll past, studying the fences, the distant hills, the sky stretching endlessly above them. When she did speak, it was with thoughtful precision, asking about water sources, winters, livestock. Practical questions, intelligent ones. Each mile unraveled another thread of his assumptions. This woman had not come seeking rescue. She had come with intention. As the ranch house came into view, modest and weather-beaten, he braced himself for disappointment. Instead, she nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. "It's honest," she said simply. "That matters." In that moment, standing beside the woman he had expected to be grateful and compliant, the cowboy felt something shift. He realized he was the one unprepared. The train had not delivered a solution, it had delivered a challenge. And for the first time in years, he found himself speechless, unsure whether he should be afraid or grateful that his carefully planned life had just veered off course. The first evening settled over the ranch with a hush that felt heavier than usual. The sun sank low, painting the sky in bruised shades of gold and violet, while the wind softened as if holding its breath. Inside the small house, the cowboy busied himself with tasks he'd done 1,000 times before hanging his coat, stoking the stove, setting out tin plates, yet everything felt unfamiliar with another presence in the room. She stood near the table, removing her gloves carefully, as though each movement mattered. He noticed how she took in the space without judgment, the narrow walls, the worn floorboards, the single window overlooking the pasture. He braced himself for disappointment or complaint, but none came. Instead, she offered a polite smile and thanked him for the journey, her voice measured and respectful. Their first real conversation began over a simple meal. He apologized for the lack of variety, explaining that supplies were scarce until the next trip to town. She assured him it was more than enough, then surprised him by asking how long he'd been running the ranch alone. The question was gentle, yet it struck close to something he rarely examined. He answered briefly, instinctively guarding himself while she listened without pressing. There was an ease in the way she listened, attentive but not intrusive. When she spoke, she chose her words carefully, revealing just enough to be courteous while keeping her deeper thoughts concealed. She spoke of the journey west, of long days on the train, of learning patience in crowded stations and strange towns. She did not mention family, nor did she explain what had driven her to answer an advertisement meant for survival rather than romance. The cowboy sensed the absence immediately. Silence can say as much as confession, and hers carried weight. He recognized it because he lived with his own unspoken losses. For a fleeting moment, he wondered what pain she had buried beneath her calm exterior, and whether it mirrored his own more than he cared to admit. Later, as they discussed practical matters, the division of work, the rhythm of the days ahead, an undercurrent of tension emerged. He explained the routines of the ranch, expecting quiet agreement. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions, clarifying details, suggesting small adjustments. None of it was defiance, yet it challenged his assumption that she would simply comply. He felt an unexpected discomfort, not from her words, but from the realization that he had anticipated obedience rather than collaboration. This woman was not here to disappear into his life. She was here to build one alongside him on her own terms. As night deepened, the conversation slowed. He showed her the small bedroom prepared for her, apologizing again for its simplicity. She thanked him sincerely and paused at the doorway, her hand resting briefly against the frame. For just a second, her composure faltered. Her eyes flickered with something raw fear, perhaps, or exhaustion before she steadied herself once more. "Thank you for not asking too much of me tonight," she said quietly. The words lingered after she closed the door. He sat alone at the table, staring at the lamp's soft glow, struck by the weight of that simple sentence. It hinted at nights in her past filled with demands, expectations, and the absence of choice. He realized then that whatever agreement had brought her here, it had not erased what came before. Lying awake later, listening to the familiar creaks of the house, the cowboy found sleep elusive. He had expected a stranger who would fit neatly into the margins of his life. Instead, he had welcomed someone carrying invisible scars, someone who asked him without accusation to reconsider what kind of man he intended to be. Their first words had been careful, restrained, and practical. Yet beneath them lay hidden wounds on both sides, quietly shaping the fragile beginning of something neither of them fully understood. Morning arrived early on the ranch, announced by pale lights slipping through the window and the distant lowing of cattle. The cowboy rose before dawn as he always had, expecting to find the house just as silent as the day before. Instead, he smelled coffee. Real coffee, not the weak brew he usually tolerated out of habit. The unexpected comfort stopped him in his tracks. She stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back with efficiency rather than vanity. She greeted him with a quiet good morning, handing him a tin cup without ceremony. There was no nervousness in her movements, no waiting for permission. She acted as though she belonged there, not as a guest, and certainly not as someone grateful simply to exist under his roof. Outside, the work of the day unfolded. He explained his plans quickly, expecting her to remain inside, but she listened and followed him out anyway. When he suggested she rest or settle into the house, she shook her head gently and asked where she would be most useful. The question was direct, practical, and disarming. He assigned her light tasks at first, more out of habit than logic. Yet she completed them with surprising speed, then moved on without prompting. She learned the layout of the land quickly, asked about the animals, the tools, the seasons. When something broke, she tried to fix it before seeking help. When she didn't know how, she watched closely, memorizing each step. By midday, he realized he was no longer supervising, he was working beside her. The shift unsettled him more than he expected. He had imagined a wife who followed instructions, someone who waited to be told what to do. Instead, she anticipated needs and made decisions. She did not undermine him, but neither did she diminish herself to accommodate his authority. Their interactions felt less like command and response, more like negotiation. Neighbors noticed, too. A passing ranch hand raised an eyebrow when he saw her repairing a loose hinge instead of watching from the porch. Later, a comment drifted over the fence, half joking, half critical about letting a woman work like a man. The cowboy laughed it off, but the words stayed with him. He realized that defending her meant challenging unspoken rules he had never questioned before. Inside the house, she reorganized shelves to make work easier, not prettier. She spoke openly about efficiency, about conserving supplies through winter, about ways to improve the garden come spring. None of it was framed as criticism, yet each suggestion highlighted how much he had accepted hardship as inevitable simply because it was familiar. That night, exhaustion settled deep into his bones, but it was different from the usual ache. It was shared. As they sat across from each other, eating quietly, he felt a strange sense of balance. For the first time in years, the weight of the ranch did not rest entirely on his shoulders. Still, discomfort lingered. He caught himself bristling when she took initiative without consulting him, then questioned why it bothered him at all. Was it pride? Habit? Fear of losing control over the only life he'd ever truly known? She noticed his tension but did not confront it directly. Instead, she respected boundaries where they mattered and pushed them where they did not. She worked not to impress or obey, but because work was how she claimed her place in the world. As he lay awake that night, the cowboy understood that the arrangement he'd made was already unraveling. He had expected compliance. What he'd gained was capability. He had wanted order without disruption. What he was facing was transformation. The woman beside him was not here to be managed. She was here to build. And in her quiet determination, she was reshaping not only the ranch, but the man who had believed his life could remain unchanged. It didn't take long for the town to notice her. In places where distance stretched wide and lives rarely changed, anything new became a subject of interest. By the time the cowboy rode into town for supplies a week later, the glances had shifted. People lingered a moment longer. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Eyes followed him in a way they never had before. The woman walking beside him, calm, composed, self-possessed, was the reason. She wore a simple dress, practical boots, and a shawl pulled close against the breeze, yet she moved through the street as though she belonged there. She greeted shopkeepers politely, met curious looks without shrinking, and asked precise questions about prices and quality. The cowboy felt the attention like heat on his back. He had expected curiosity. He had not expected scrutiny. The whispers started softly, carried like dust on the wind. Doesn't look like the usual sort. Too educated, if you ask me. Mail order, they say, but she speaks like a teacher. He caught fragments as they passed, his jaw tightening with each one. Some remarks were dismissive, others edged with envy, but all of them made clear one thing: she didn't fit the narrow role the town expected her to fill. The unease he'd felt on the ranch returned, sharpened by the realization that defending her here would mean more than private discomfort. At the mercantile, an old acquaintance clapped him on the shoulder and offered a crooked smile. "Didn't expect you to end up with someone like that," the man said, tone light but eyes calculating. "She's got opinions." The cowboy forced a chuckle, unsure how to respond. He wasn't yet ready to admit to anyone or himself that her opinions had already changed the way he saw his life. She noticed the tension immediately. Outside the store, as he loaded supplies into the wagon, she asked quietly if she'd done something wrong. The question surprised him. For all her strength, she carried the awareness of someone accustomed to being judged. He shook his head and told her the town would adjust in time. She nodded, accepting the answer, but he could tell she knew better. On the ride home, the wind tugged at her shawl as she stared out across the open land. "People fear what doesn't fit their expectations," she said after a long silence. "I've learned that much." That night, the rumors followed them back to the ranch. A neighbor rode over under the guise of friendliness, his questions thinly veiled. Where was she from? Why had she chosen this arrangement? What had she done before? The cowboy answered curtly, feeling a flare of protectiveness he hadn't anticipated. When the man left, the air felt charged. Later, by the fire, she spoke more than she had before. Not the full truth. He sensed there was still much she guarded, but enough to explain the shape of the whispers. She admitted she had been educated, that she had once lived a very different life, and that circumstances beyond her control had forced her into choices she would not have made otherwise. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," she said softly. "I came because I needed a place where I could start over." The cowboy studied her across the firelight, seeing her now through the lens of the town's judgment and rejecting it. He realized the rumors weren't truly about her past. They were about control, about whether a woman like her could exist without being diminished. The next day, when another comment was made in passing, he didn't laugh it off. He corrected it, calmly, publicly. The moment felt small, but it marked a shift. Defending her meant stepping outside the comfort of silence he'd lived in for years. The wind carried gossip as easily as it carried dust, but it also carried change. And for the first time, the cowboy understood that choosing her meant more than bringing her home. It meant standing beside her, even when the world tried to pull them apart. The night she finally told him the truth, the wind was restless, rattling the windows and sending sparks leaping in the hearth. The ranch lay quiet beyond the walls, wrapped in darkness so complete it felt like the world had narrowed to the small circle of firelight between them. They had finished supper in silence, the kind that was no longer awkward but heavy with things unsaid. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring into the flames as if gathering courage from their steady glow. The cowboy did not rush her. He had learned that patience was a form of respect. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but he could hear the strain beneath it. "I didn't answer your advertisement because I wanted an easy life," she began. "I answered because it was the first choice that was truly mine." The words settled between them. She explained slowly, carefully, revealing a past shaped by promises that had turned into cages. She had once trusted the wrong men who saw her intelligence as something to exploit, not value. Education had been offered as opportunity, then used as leverage. When she resisted the life laid out for her, the protection she'd believed in vanished. Her voice wavered only once when she spoke of how quickly respect could turn into ownership, how easily a woman's independence could be reframed as ingratitude. She had learned to survive by appearing agreeable, by hiding her strength behind silence. By the time she realized how trapped she was, escape had become her only option. The mail-order arrangement had not been desperation, she said, but strategy. A contract, however imperfect, offered clarity. Distance offered safety. She had chosen a man who described himself honestly, who did not promise luxury or control. She had chosen him because he seemed unlikely to demand more than she could give. The cowboy listened, his chest tightening with each detail. Anger flared not at her, but at the world that had cornered her into such a choice. He recognized pieces of his own life in her story. The way responsibility could become a prison, the way survival often required surrendering parts of oneself. "I didn't come here to be saved," she said, lifting her eyes to meet his. "I came to stand on my own again." "I hoped you'd let me." The fire popped, sending a spark spiraling upward. In that moment, he understood the depth of the trust she was offering. This was not confession for sympathy, it was a line drawn. An invitation to either repeat the past or refuse it. He told her simply that she owed him nothing beyond honesty. That whatever this marriage became, it would not be another cage. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to steady her. He realized he meant them not as obligation, but as choice. They spoke late into the night, not of romance, but of boundaries. Of what partnership could look like when neither person held power over the other. She admitted her fear of being diminished again. He admitted his fear of losing control over a life he had built alone. Naming those fears stripped them of their power. When she finally rose to retire for the night, her steps were lighter, as if she had set something down. He remained by the fire long after, staring into the embers, changed by what he had heard. The truth she shared did not push him away. It anchored him. He understood now that her courage was not loud or reckless, it was deliberate. She had chosen this life with eyes open, and in doing so, trouble arrived without warning, the way it often did on the frontier quietly, then all at once. The cowboy first sensed it in the way she went still when the rider appeared at the edge of the property. Dust rose in a slow cloud as the horse approached, and from the porch he saw her posture change, her shoulders tightening, her hand curling unconsciously into a fist. She did not say his name, but she didn't have to. Some instincts were learned the hard way. The man dismounted with practiced ease, his coat fine enough to mark him as someone out of place on a working ranch. He smiled as though he owned the right to be there, eyes moving over the land, the house, and finally settling on her with something close to satisfaction. The cowboy stepped forward at once, placing himself between them without thinking. The visitor spoke smoothly, addressing her as if the past had never loosened its grip. He hinted at unfinished business, obligations left unpaid, arrangements broken. His words were chosen carefully, no outright threats, just enough implication to unsettle. He suggested she had been foolish to think distance erased promises. She did not retreat. Her voice was steady when she answered, though her face had gone pale. She told him she owed him nothing, that whatever hold he believed he had was long gone. The man's smile thinned. He turned his attention to the cowboy then, questioning ownership, legality, intent. Was she truly his wife, or merely another arrangement that could be undone? The question struck harder than any insult. The cowboy felt the old instinct rise to claim, to assert authority. It would have been easy. Accepted. But he caught her gaze and saw something fragile there. Not weakness, but fear of being claimed again as property rather than person. He answered differently. She's here because she chose to be, he said evenly. And she stays because she wants to. That's the only claim that matters. The air shifted. The visitor's confidence wavered, replaced by irritation. He warned them both of consequences, of reputations, of how easily a woman's past could be used against her. Then he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving the threat hanging like smoke. Afterward, silence pressed in. She trembled once the danger had passed, the effort of composure giving way to exhaustion. The cowboy guided her inside without words, set her down by the table, and poured water with hands that shook slightly himself. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to bring this to you." He shook his head. "You didn't bring it," he said. "It followed." "That's not the same thing." They talked long into the night. She explained who the man was not in detail, but enough to make clear the danger he represented. He had power, connections, and a belief that people existed to serve his designs. Leaving him had been an act of defiance, one that came with a cost. The cowboy listened, anger burning slow and steady in his chest. Not the reckless kind, but the kind that hardened into resolve. He realized this was the moment that defined everything. He could push her away to protect his peace, or he could stand with her and risk losing it. By morning, his decision was made. When word reached town, carried by the same wind that spread rumors, he did not hide. He corrected lies, refused insinuations, and made it clear publicly that any business involving his wife came through him. Not as ownership, but as unity. She watched him do it, something breaking and healing all at once in her eyes. The past had come calling, demanding surrender. Instead, it met resistance. And in standing beside her, not in front, not above, the cowboy crossed a line he could never uncross. He was no longer a man guarding his solitude. He was a partner choosing her, openly and without regret, no matter the cost. The days after the confrontation carried a different weight. The land looked the same. The fences stretched long and weathered. The cattle moved lazily across the pasture. The sky remained vast and indifferent, but something fundamental had shifted between them. The threat from her past had not vanished, yet it no longer hovered unspoken. It had been named, faced, and answered. And in doing so, it had changed the shape of their relationship. She was the one who spoke first, one quiet evening as they worked side by side repairing a section of fence. "You didn't have to do that," she said, not looking at him. "You could have let him take me back into fear." He paused, wire cutters hanging loosely in his hand. "That wasn't an option," he replied simply. The truth of it surprised him. There had been a time when he would have stepped aside to avoid trouble, believing peace was found in isolation. But standing with her had felt less like sacrifice and more like alignment, his actions finally matching the man he wanted to be. That night, they sat at the table long after supper, the lamp casting a steady glow between them. She spoke carefully, explaining that protection, however well-intended, could become another form of control if not handled with care. She had lived under watchful eyes before, and she needed to know that his support did not come with invisible strings. He listened, really listened, and when she finished, he admitted his own fears. He had spent his life alone because solitude was predictable. Partnership meant compromise, vulnerability, and the possibility of loss. "I don't want to cage you," he said, "but I don't want to stand aside either." They began then to define what partnership meant to them deliberately, thoughtfully. Decisions about the ranch would be shared. Work would be divided by ability, not expectation. Privacy would be respected, but secrets would not be demanded. Above all, choice would remain intact. Either of them could speak up. Either of them could say no. In the days that followed, this new understanding took shape in small, tangible ways. She handled negotiations in town with confidence, and he stood beside her without speaking over her. He consulted her before making changes to the land, valuing her insight. When disagreements arose, as they inevitably did, they were addressed openly rather than swallowed in silence. Neighbors noticed the difference. This was not the arrangement they recognized. It wasn't hierarchy. It wasn't performance. It was two people moving in rhythm, each steadying the other without erasing themselves. Some disapproved. Others, quietly, admired it. One afternoon, she returned from town visibly shaken by an encounter nothing dangerous, just a reminder of how easily people tried to diminish her. Instead of taking over, he asked what she needed. The answer was simple: trust. He gave it freely. The word marriage had once meant something narrow to the cowboy routine, responsibility and a quiet exchange of labor that kept life running. It had been a structure, not a feeling. But now, as weeks turned into months, that definition no longer held. What they were building did not fit the model he de-inherited from the land or the men around him. It was something slower, more deliberate, shaped by daily decisions rather than ceremony. They did not wake one morning suddenly in love. Instead, affection grew in the in-between moments, in the way she handed him a cup of coffee without asking, already knowing how he took it, in the way he noticed when her shoulders tightened and gave her space without retreating. Trust settled between them like a shared language, spoken fluently without words. Work became a rhythm rather than a burden. They planned together, argued occasionally, and learned when to yield. She brought a sense of foresight to the ranch, thinking seasons ahead, calculating risks he'd always accepted as fate. He brought steadiness and follow-through, grounding her ideas in what the land could realistically give. Each respected the other's strengths without turning them into expectations. In town, they presented a united front, but not a performative one. She spoke for herself. He stood beside her, not in front. When people asked questions that crossed lines, they answered with calm clarity or not all. Over time, the gossip lost its edge. People adjusted, as they always did, when faced with something consistent and unyielding. At home, boundaries continued to matter. She claimed a corner of the house as her own: books, writing, quiet thought, and he respected it without resentment. He, in turn, guarded certain routines that kept him grounded. Instead of colliding, their separate needs created balance. Marriage, they learned, was not about merging into one indistinguishable whole, but about coexisting without erosion. One night, during a storm that rattled the roof and sent rain pounding against the windows, she spoke of the future with a vulnerability he had not yet seen. She admitted fear not of the land or the work, but of believing too deeply in something that could be taken away. He answered honestly, confessing that he feared failing her more than he feared being alone again. They did not promise forever in sweeping terms. They promised attention, effort, honesty, the kind of devotion that showed up on ordinary days when nothing dramatic demanded it. The cowboy realized then that this marriage had taught him something the land never had. Strength did not come from control, but from adaptability, from the willingness to listen and change course when needed. Loving her meant allowing himself to be influenced and trusting that doing so did not make him weaker. She, too, was changing. The guardedness that once defined her softened. She laughed more freely. She argued without fear of consequence. Slowly, she began to believe that partnership did not require sacrifice of self. By the time winter edged closer, their bond had settled into something durable. Not perfect, not untouched by fear or memory, but real. Built from respect and sustained by choice. Marriage, they discovered, was not the end of independence, but its refinement. Together, they were not less than they had been alone. They were more because they had chosen to remain, not out of need, but out of love grown quietly and intentionally. The first snow fell softly, almost shyly, dusting the land in white and muffling the world beyond the ranch. The cowboy stood at the window, watching the familiar fields transformed, and felt a quiet astonishment settle over him. His life had not turned out the way he had planned, and for the first time, that realization brought peace instead of unease. Months earlier, he had waited on a train platform expecting simplicity. He had believed survival meant narrowing his world, trimming away desire until only necessity remained. Now the house behind him carried warmth, not just from the fire, but from presence, from conversation, from shared purpose. She moved through the room with unhurried confidence, humming softly as she set a kettle on the stove. The sound was small, ordinary, and profound. It was the sound of someone at ease, someone who had chosen to stay. They spoke often of the future now, not in grand declarations, but in practical hopes, expanding the garden, repairing the barn come spring, perhaps opening the ranch to travelers passing through. Each plan carried the quiet assumption of we. It no longer felt like an experiment or a risk. It felt like continuity. The past still existed. Letters arrived occasionally, rumors drifted in from town, and some nights memories pressed closer than others, but they no longer ruled the present. Together they had learned how to face uncertainty without surrendering themselves to it. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she asked him what he'd expected when he sent for a mail-order bride. The question made him smile ruefully. He admitted the truth, that he had imagined someone obedient, uncomplicated, grateful. Someone who would fit neatly into his life without asking him to change. "And now?" she asked. "Now I'm grateful I was wrong," he said without hesitation. She reached for his hand, not out of need, but affection. The gesture was simple, unforced, and it carried everything they had built. He realized then that love had not arrived as a sudden blaze. It had grown like the land itself, slow, patient, shaped by seasons of effort and care. The community, too, had changed in subtle ways. Some neighbors softened. Others remained distant. It mattered less now. Their life no longer required approval. It stood on its own foundation. As winter deepened, the ranch became a place of refuge, not just from the cold, but from the world they had both escaped in different ways. They hosted quiet dinners, shared stories, and allowed joy to arrive without suspicion. On a clear night, beneath a sky sharp with stars, the cowboy